Mr. President, as you know, right now we are debating on the Senate floor the National Defense Authorization Act. And I want to congratulate Senator Inhofe, my good friend from Oklahoma, and the acting chairman of the Armed Services Committee. I also certainly want to congratulate Senator McCain, who we're all praying for, who's struggling with some health issues right now, who's the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, and Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island, the ranking member on the Armed Services Committee, for the great work they have done shepherding this very important piece of legislation through the committee process, and now we have it on the floor and we're debating it. It's certainly one of the most important pieces of legislation we bring to the Senate floor every year. Over 50 years, without missing one year, we have moved the NDAA bill, which authorizes funding and policies for the men and women in our military, through the Senate floor. So there's a bunch of things in this bill that are very important for our troops, for the national defense of our nation. And by the way, it's a very bipartisan bill, just like it was last year. So we're going to be discussing this for the next week, and hopefully people watching back home or here in Washington will get a sense of just how important this legislation is. But what I wanted to do this afternoon, Mr. President, is talk about two provisions that my team and I authored in this bill, two provisions that are very important as the President of the United States and his team head to Singapore for the summit that the world is watching with the dictator of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. And I wanted to highlight two key sections because what they are meant to do is strengthen the President's hand and the leverage of the United States as the leaders of our country move into these negotiations with a very unpredictable dictator who, in my view, we can't trust a lot. We can't trust at all. But nevertheless, what we're trying to do is bolster the President's hand in these negotiations, and we're all cautiously optimistic that something positive can come out of this summit. So what are these two provisions, Mr. President? First deals with strengthening America's missile defense, and the second one focuses on the status of U.S. military forces on the Korean Peninsula. So what I'd like to do first is talk about the missile defense provisions in the NDAA this year. Now, as this chart shows, Kim Jong-un has dramatically increased testing for North Korea's missile program and nuclear program. If you look at what happened under his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, and his father, Kim Jong-il, the current leader of North Korea has dramatically increased both the testing on intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear missiles, and nuclear weapons. Now, fortunately, and I think the American people want this, we've seen this threat coming. A number of us have seen this threat coming. So that's why in last year's National Defense Authorization, we had a bill. My office authored it, but we had many co-sponsors, Democrats and Republicans, to significantly enhance our nation's missile defense. That passed in the NDAA. It was fully funded by the end of the year, almost $5 billion to increase missile defense for our nation. And what it did, it increased capacity, building new fields of missiles that can shoot down any incoming missiles. It increased capability. That would mean accelerating technology for multiple warheads on top of each missile to, again, increase our ability to shoot down any incoming missile. And it required much more testing by the Missile Defense Agency so we can perfect the regional and homeland missile defenses that we have here in the United States. Big progress. It's already happening. And of course, that's really, really important given the threat that we now face as a country. Now, Mr. President, as Alaska's senator, I'm proud of the fact that actually most of our nation's missile defense is located in the great state of Alaska. And this is simply physics. This is physics and location, location, location. If there's going to be a threat either from Iran or North Korea or anywhere else with regard to the United States of America, that threat is almost always going to fly over Alaska. So we have our radar systems there. We have long-range discrimination radar there. We have the missile fields protecting every city from New York to LA to Miami, all based in the great state of Alaska. So what are we doing this year? Well, we have an entire new section in the NDAA that builds on what we did last year to dramatically increase our nation's missile defense even more, because you can never be too sure on this. This is an insurance policy that's going to protect every city in America. So this year, in the current NDAA that we're debating right now, the big issues here with regard to missile defense is that this bill calls for the development and deployment of space-based sensors. It mandates these within the next couple years. Critical. It also promotes a more integrated missile defense, accelerates our defenses against what are called hypersonic threats, not ballistic missiles, but hypersonic threats. And importantly, Mr. President, in terms of missile defense, this bill focuses on our allies, working together with our allies in Korea, in Japan, in other places in Europe, to share these missile defense capabilities so we, as our allies, have a much more robust system. Let me just talk briefly on the really important issue of space-based sensors. Every expert that has testified in front of the Armed Services Committee, whether the current director of the Missile Defense Agency, General Greaves, whether the four-star general in charge of Strategic Command, General Hyten, or whether the former director of the Missile Defense Agency, Admiral Searing, they have all said space-based sensors are critical. The time is now. What does that mean? What does that do? Well, we have different systems in different parts of the country or different parts of the world. In South Korea, we have the THAAD system. Off the coast of Japan, with our Navy, we have the Aegis system ashore and on our Navy ships. And then back home, we have the home-based system, and that's mostly based in Alaska. What a space-based sensor program does is it integrates all these systems and has the ability to track with what the military calls an unblinking eye, the ability to track a missile that's shot at our country or shot at our troops from the moment it's shot until the end. We don't have that yet, but we need it to integrate these different systems, and importantly, that's what the NDAA that we're debating this year will do to further bolster our nation's missile defense. Why do we need that? Mr. President, there's been a lot of recent goodwill with regard to Kim Jong-un, but I just want to read a quote from him just this past January, 6 months ago. His New Year's Day quote said, quote, "The whole of the United States mainland is within the range of our nuclear strike, and the nuclear button is on my office desk all the time. The United States needs to clearly be aware that this is not merely a threat, but a reality. This year, we should focus on mass-producing nuclear warheads and ballistic missiles for operational deployment." Okay, that's Kim Jong-un just a couple months ago. So let's not be taken by this dictator too much as he meets with the president. He and his dad and his grandfather have been threatening the United States and our troops on the Peninsula and our allies, Korea and Japan, for decades. And what we're doing with this technology, state-of-the-art, with this missile defense system, is we are giving the President additional leverage in his negotiations. Indeed, when people are looking at, hey, why did Kim Jong-un come to the table? He's been very belligerent. He's saying these things like he said on his New Year's Day address. It's really three things, Mr. President: the maximum pressure campaign, the diplomatic campaign by the President, by the administration, by this Congress. We've passed legislation, very aggressive legislation on sanctions. It's been the development by Secretary Mattis of credible military options. In the event diplomacy doesn't work, the Koreans know that we're serious. And that's ongoing. And with the Secretary of Defense, former four-star Marine General Secretary Mattis, I don't think anyone thinks he's bluffing. So that's putting pressure on the North Koreans. And then it's this system. It's this system. Because the North Koreans know we now are developing the technology. If Kim Jong-un does want to go out in a flame of glory and try and fire 1 or 2 or 3 intercontinental ballistic nuclear missiles at New York or Chicago or LA, the system we have here and that we are further bolstering will shoot it down. So, this is going to give the President more leverage. The second section, it's actually Section 1249, Mr. President, of the NDAA, that we are confident is going to increase the President's leverage, involves the critical issue of our U.S. military forces on the Korean Peninsula. This section expresses the will of the Senate by highlighting some key points as it relates to our military on the Korean Peninsula and the history of that military. So, what's in this section, Mr. President? It talks about how the United States and South Korea have been allies for decades, and how our military forces on the Korean Peninsula, working closely in conjunction with the South Korean military and our alliance, have been the linchpin of peace and security, not just on the Korean Peninsula, but in the entire Indo-Pacific region. This resolution, this provision of the NDAA, focuses on how South Korea has contributed heavily to not only its own defense, but what our military forces are doing on the Korean Peninsula. It emphasizes that United States military forces, pursuant to international law since the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, have been lawfully deployed on the Korean Peninsula, and yet the nuclear and ballistic missile programs of North Korea are in clear and consistent violations of UN Security Council resolutions and international law. Importantly, Mr. President, this provision focuses on the fact that China and Russia and North Korea have had as their long-term strategic goals the removal of U.S. military forces on the Korean Peninsula. That's what they want. And indeed, there are reports in the media and other places where President Xi Jinping of China may be trying to coach Kim Jong-un, saying, hey, when you go into these negotiations with President Trump, one thing you should shoot for is to get rid of those American forces on the Korean Peninsula. Make that one of your goals. So, Mr. President, this provision ends by saying it's a sense of the Senate, by the way, a bipartisan sense of the Senate, that the significant removal of U.S. military forces from the Korean Peninsula is a non-negotiable item with Kim Jong-un for his nukes. We are not going to trade lawfully deployed U.S. military forces on the peninsula for illegal nukes that the North Koreans have developed. So what are we trying to do here? Well, first of all, Mr. President, this is a point that Secretary Mattis has been emphasizing. As a matter of fact, with a couple other senators last week, I led a codel of senators to a defense ministers conference in Singapore. This is the biggest military conference of defense ministers, foreign ministers in the entire Asia-Pacific region. Secretary Mattis and his team, the Secretary of the Navy, the Admiral in charge of the Indo-Pacific, they were all there. We met with them, strategized with them. Secretary Mattis gave a great speech on U.S. strategy in the Asia-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, as we're now calling it. But he was asked about this very topic. And he said, this is not an issue that is on the table with Kim Jong-un, nor should it be. It is not even a subject of negotiation. The issue of possibly removing U.S. military forces, you see here in a picture U.S. Marines and ROK Marines training together. We're not even going to talk about the issue of removing our legally deployed forces on the peninsula in exchange for illegally developed nukes and intercontinental ballistic missiles. This is what Secretary Mattis said last week in front of all the defense ministers of Asia. And what we're trying to do with this provision in the NDAA is strengthen the leverage of the administration and to show Kim Jong-un, and let's face it, Russia and China, who want these forces gone, that the Congress of the United States and the executive branch, the Trump administration, speak with one voice on this issue. What this provision in the NDAA says is exactly what Secretary Mattis said last week. So we are speaking with one voice on this very important issue that is likely going to come up in Singapore when the president's there. And again, we know that some of our adversaries or potential adversaries in the region want these forces gone. Well, Mr. President, I don't think that makes strategic sense. And fortunately, neither does a very strong bipartisan group of U.S. senators. And when this bill passes the Senate, we're going to have the entire Senate speaking with one voice on this. Now, I've had the opportunity to talk to Secretary Mattis and Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador Bolton, the National Security Advisor, and the President about this provision in the NDAA and how it's our intent, the Senate's intent, to give them more leverage in the upcoming negotiations with North Korea. And I think they're all appreciative of what we're trying to do in the Senate with this important section in the National Defense Authorization Act. Mr. President, let me conclude by making a point. It's a bit of a historical point, but it's actually quite an important point as we're talking about this topic. Because the Senate of the United States has actually played a critical role on this very issue previously. Some might recall that President Jimmy Carter, when he was elected, actually ran on the topic, one of the campaign promises that he made, remarkably, because I think it was strategically very misguided, was he ran on the issue of, hey, when I get elected, I'm going to remove U.S. military forces out of South Korea. That's what Jimmy Carter campaigned on. And when he got in, he started to look at ways to implement that. Well, Mr. President, then the Senate reacted. You have long-term strategic interests represented by this body and a very famous senator of the president's own party. Jimmy Carter was a Democrat. Senator Scoop Jackson of Washington State, well-known senator, well-known foreign policy and national security expert, led a delegation of senators to South Korea. And they looked at this issue in detail after President Carter was elected. And they came back to Washington after this trip and they said, this is not a good idea. Removing our forces who have kept the peace on the Korean Peninsula since 1953, we don't think this is a good idea. And the story goes that Scoop Jackson actually went to the White House and talked to President Carter and said that the Senate of the United States is going to oppose this. You're going to have a hard time removing these troops. So we have a role to play here, and we've had a role to play here, and we played this role. Now, Mr. President, I want to end with one final anecdote from that trip. The Senate Navy liaison officer who helped lead that delegation of senators in the late 1970s to South Korea was a Navy captain by the name of John McCain. Yes, that's right, the John McCain, who I mentioned we're all praying for, who, by the way, we've named this bill after him. This is the John S. McCain National Defense Authorization Act. The current chairman of the Armed Services Committee that wrote this bill, he was on that trip as a captain in the U.S. Navy. And I think that historical fact makes this provision in the current bill that we're debating now, the John S. McCain National Defense Authorization Act, even more powerful. I yield the floor.